Donald Trump, known for his larger-than-life persona and wealth, had always lived in a world where status and money ruled. But recently, he began feeling disconnected from the everyday struggles of ordinary people. His life, surrounded by luxury and privilege, made him wonder, what is life really like for those who don't have the comforts he enjoys? Wanting to understand how society treats the less fortunate, Trump decided to take a drastic step. He would go undercover as a homeless person. His goal wasn't to make a statement or cause trouble. He simply wanted to experience firsthand the way people treat those who are without homes, money, or status. He chose one of the most prestigious restaurants in New York City, known for its elite clientele and reputation for treating people based on their status. It was the perfect place for his experiment. Trump knew that the restaurant's staff and patrons were used to seeing only the wealthy and influential. If he could blend in as a homeless person in such an environment, he would get an unfiltered view of how society saw him, someone who wasn't instantly recognizable as a billionaire. Trump transformed himself for the experiment. He wore ragged clothes that had seen better days, with patches and dirt staining his sleeves. His hair was messy, his face unshaven, and a worn-out backpack hung from his shoulders. He looked like someone who had been living on the streets for a long time. Walking into the restaurant, he felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he was determined to see the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. Trump entered the restaurant quietly, hoping to go unnoticed. The high-end eatery was bustling with activity, filled with well-dressed patrons sipping expensive wine and enjoying gourmet meals. As he made his way past the polished tables and pristine floors, he could feel the eyes of the restaurant staff following him. Their gazes weren't welcoming, they were filled with judgment and disdain. Trump tried to walk confidently, but it was clear that his appearance set him apart from everyone else in the room. The waitstaff exchanged uncomfortable glances as he passed, their expressions hardening as he came closer. The host, a young woman dressed in an expensive uniform, glanced up from her station as Trump approached. Her eyes briefly scanned him up and down before she put on a fake smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice cool and dismissive. Trump took a deep breath. "Yes, I'd like a seat," he said, his voice low but steady. She hesitated for a moment, as if deciding where to place him. Without a word, she motioned toward a corner of the restaurant, far from the best tables. "You can sit over there," she said, her tone making it clear that she didn't expect him to stay long. As Trump made his way to the designated seat, he overheard a few whispers from nearby diners. They looked at him with a mix of curiosity and judgment, clearly making assumptions about who he was and why he was there. Trump sat down, trying to ignore the stares that followed him. He knew this was part of the experiment. But the more he sat there, the more uncomfortable he became. The waitstaff was equally unwelcoming. One waiter, who had passed by earlier, now shot Trump an eye roll as he approached. When Trump asked about the menu, the waiter barely glanced at him, offering short, impatient responses. Another waiter scoffed when he asked about the specials, acting as if his presence in the restaurant was a nuisance. Trump couldn't help but notice how everyone seemed to treat him differently. It wasn't just the staff. The other diners, who had been enjoying their meals just moments before, now avoided his gaze, turning their attention elsewhere. Some even seemed to make a point of looking away when he tried to engage in small talk. It became painfully clear, in this world, wealth and status were everything. Without them, you were invisible, or worse, unwanted. As the minutes passed, Trump began to reflect on the way society viewed those who were homeless. He realized that it wasn't just the restaurant staff who had judged him, it was everyone around him. People didn't see him as a person, they saw his appearance and immediately assumed he was beneath them. It was a sobering realization that made Trump question everything he thought he knew about society, and the way it treats those who are struggling. He had always lived in a bubble, protected by his wealth and fame, but now, for the first time, he understood just how harsh the world could be for those who had nothing. As Trump sat quietly in the corner, nursing a glass of water, he began to feel the weight of his experiment. The uncomfortable stares continued, and the subtle judgment from the staff made it clear that he wasn't welcome. It seemed like the restaurant was a world of its own, a place where money and status decided who belonged and who didn't. Trump had expected this treatment, but that didn't make it any easier to endure. He had come here to learn, to understand, but the harsh reality was sinking in deeper than he had imagined. Then, the door to the restaurant opened with a soft chime, signaling the arrival of a new group of guests. Trump noticed them immediately, a group of well-dressed businessmen, their expensive suits cutting through the atmosphere like they owned the place. The staff's demeanor shifted instantly. The hosts straightened up, the waiters hurried to greet them, and the diners nearby seemed to make room for their arrival. Trump couldn't help but watch as the men settled at a table near the center of the room. One of them, a man with slicked back hair and a confident smile, glanced around before his eyes landed on Trump. The businessman's face lit up with recognition. "You! Wait a minute," he said, his voice rising with a hint of surprise. "Aren't you Donald Trump?" Trump blinked, taken aback. He hadn't expected anyone to recognize him in his current state. He had gone to great lengths to conceal his identity, but apparently it wasn't enough. The man continued, clearly excited. "What are you doing here? This is incredible! You have to come sit with us." Trump, unsure of how to respond, hesitated. But before he could decline, the businessman stood up and gestured to a chair at the VIP table. "Come on. We have plenty of space. It's an honor to meet you. Please join us." The shift in the room was immediate. The staff, who had barely acknowledged Trump up until that point, suddenly perked up. The host rushed over with a wide smile, offering him the best seat in the house. The waiters were suddenly eager to take his order, suggesting the finest wines and delicacies with enthusiasm. But once dismissive looks had vanished, replaced by polite nods and fawning gestures, Trump was stunned. He had been sitting in that same chair for hours, ignored and judged by the very same staff, and yet now, when the businessman recognized him, everything changed. It was as if the room itself had transformed. Suddenly, he wasn't a homeless man anymore. He was Donald Trump, the billionaire. The VIP treatment was offered without hesitation, and the restaurant's atmosphere shifted to accommodate him. It was a shocking moment that made him realize just how deeply entrenched social hierarchies were in this world. He didn't take the seat. Instead, Trump chose to stay in his disguise. The shift in behavior had been too dramatic, too revealing to ignore. He wanted to see more, to understand the full extent of what wealth and status could do to people's behavior. For what felt like an eternity, Trump sat in the corner, observing the scene unfold before him. The contrast between the way he was treated now and how he had been treated earlier was stark. The businessmen at the VIP table were laughing, enjoying themselves, and discussing business deals over expensive wine. Every staff member was practically falling over themselves to ensure their comfort. Meanwhile, Trump, still disguised as a homeless man, watched the diners continue with their lives, none the wiser about the truth. The host, who had once been cold and dismissive, was now bending over backward to please the guests. He had recognized the wealthy businessmen and was treating them with the utmost respect. When Trump noticed the host glancing at him, he couldn't help but see the difference in the way he was being treated compared to the businessmen. The staff was now polite, apologetic, and eager to provide the best experience for him, because he was somebody, now. It was in that moment that Trump knew it was time for the big reveal. He had seen enough. The stark difference in treatment based on appearance and status was undeniable. He stood up, his heart racing, and took a deep breath. The restaurant fell silent as he slowly removed his tattered backpack and straightened his posture. He walked toward the center of the room, and with a commanding voice he addressed the room. "I'm Donald Trump," he said, his voice steady but full of conviction. "And you've all been treating me like a nobody, simply because of how I look." The silence in the restaurant was deafening. The businessmen who had recognized him earlier looked up in shock. The staff froze, their faces turning pale as they realized who they had been serving, or rather, who they had been ignoring. The diners looked around in disbelief, their eyes widening as the truth sank in. The host, who had earlier treated Trump with coldness, now rushed over, stumbling over his words as he tried to apologize. "Mr. Trump, we didn't know. I'm so sorry," he said, bowing his head in embarrassment. But Trump wasn't finished. He turned to the rest of the restaurant, his voice loud and clear. "This is what it takes for people to get treated with respect around here: wealth, status, recognition. But what about the people who don't have those things? Why do we treat them so poorly?" The room was tense as Trump's words hung in the air. He continued, his voice becoming more impassioned. "It doesn't matter what a person looks like or how much money they have. Everyone deserves respect, dignity, and kindness. We need to stop judging people based on their appearance. Because what we do to others says everything about who we are." For a moment, there was no sound in the room except the heavy silence that followed his speech. And then, one by one, the staff began to apologize. The businessmen, still in shock, nodded silently. It wasn't just an apology. It was a realization, a shift in perspective. Trump didn't wait for any more apologies. He simply nodded and walked out of the restaurant, leaving behind a room full of people who would never look at someone in need the same way again. The lesson had been learned. And for Trump, the experience had been eye-opening. He realized that wealth and status shouldn't define who a person is. What mattered was how we treat one another, regardless of our differences. The restaurant remained quiet for a long time after he left, but in that silence, something had changed. As Trump walked out of the restaurant, the weight of his experience stayed with him. The door swung shut behind him, and for a moment, it felt like the world outside had returned to its usual pace. But inside, the restaurant was left in stunned silence. The guests who had been dining, the staff who had been scrambling to redeem themselves, it all felt frozen in time. The loud chatter, the clinking of silverware, the noise of an evening in full swing, everything had been replaced with a quiet, uncomfortable reflection. In the moments following his dramatic reveal, many of the diners had quietly returned to their meals, their faces still registering shock and confusion. Some exchanged awkward glances, unsure of what to say. Others sat deep in thought, perhaps reconsidering the way they viewed people they passed by on the streets every day, the homeless, the struggling, the overlooked. Trump's words had struck a chord, whether they were ready to admit it or not. Meanwhile, the staff, now humbled, gathered in the corner. The host, who had once shown such disdain for Trump's disguised persona, was apologizing repeatedly, his face flushed with embarrassment. The waiters, who had once rolled their eyes at simple questions, were now quietly processing what had just happened. The manager approached, still trying to regain some composure, but it was clear that the experience had shaken everyone. They had been confronted with their own biases, their own assumptions about what it meant to belong in a place like this. And all of it had come to light, all thanks to a man who had walked in without a dime to his name, only to leave them with a lesson they would likely never forget. Trump, however, didn't stay for the apologies or the newfound VIP treatment that had been so quickly offered to him. He hadn't come there for any of that. He wasn't interested in exploiting the situation and making a spectacle of the moment. Instead, he walked out quietly, leaving behind a hefty tip for the staff as a final act of kindness, something simple, yet meaningful. His tip wasn't just about money, it was a gesture of respect, a reminder that it wasn't about the wealth you held, but the way you treated others. It was a silent statement: no one should be treated differently because of how they look, how they dress, or how much money they have in their pockets. As Trump stepped out into the cool New York City air, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of peace. The city around him hummed with life, the usual rush of traffic and pedestrians carrying on as if nothing had changed. But for Trump, something had shifted. He had witnessed firsthand how the world's treatment of others could be altered by something as simple as appearance, and it had left an indelible mark on his thoughts. How many times had he walked past someone on the street, someone with tattered clothes or a weathered face, and not thought twice? How many others, just like him, had seen homeless people and made quick judgments without ever considering their struggles, their humanity? Trump found himself wondering, what would it take to change the way people saw one another? How many people needed to experience the same kind of shock he had felt to realize that true worth wasn't tied to the clothes you wore or the wealth you accumulated? Could a moment like this spark a larger movement of empathy, of treating others with the respect and kindness they deserved? As he walked further down the street, the weight of his thoughts grew heavier. True societal progress, he realized, would require more than just changing the behavior of a few individuals. It would require a change in mindset, a deeper shift in how people viewed each other. It was easy to focus on status, to judge others based on their outward appearance. But it was much harder, and far more meaningful, to look beyond that and see people for who they really were. Trump couldn't help but feel a bit of hope, despite the somber nature of his realization. Perhaps, just perhaps, moments like these could change the way people treated each other. He didn't know how, or when, but he was certain that his small, quiet act of empathy, of stepping into the shoes of someone who had no power or status, had started something. And maybe if enough people could see the truth in his actions, that shift would grow, one small moment at a time. For now, though, all he could do was carry the lesson with him, wondering how many others would be willing to take a step toward greater understanding, and what the world might look like if they did.